Great. I'd like to welcome you all to Views from the Capitol with the State Budget Office. We're joined by Bethany Wixel and Beth Bullion. I'm going to turn it over to them and have them do their presentation. And when we're done, we'll take questions. You can put your questions in the chat box, or there is a raise hand feature and we can call on you. But we ask you to please stay muted until you are speaking, just to cut down on all of the background noise. So I am Jennifer Smith, Director of Government Relations for MASB, for those of you that don't know me. Joining me co-hosting this are Jeff Cobb and Deshandra Bedingfield, the rest of our GR team. But I will now turn it over to Bethany and Beth, and if you want to unmute yourselves and take it away.
Thanks. I'm going to put a PowerPoint up so that you can follow along as we go, and Jen will be able to make that available to you. All right, there we go. So thanks for having us. Obviously, we're all working in a very uncertain time right now, so I appreciate you all taking the time for us to hopefully shed a little light on where we're at the state level. Obviously, unfortunately, right now, we're still working with more unknowns than knowns, but sometimes I know that's at least comforting to know that we're working through things, and so we'll share what we do know and what we think that the current timeline looks like for better information. So I think it's helpful for context to give you a couple of slides about what the total budget is currently for general fund and school aid fund, both combined, and then a separate general fund piece, just so that you can understand what the state's looking at. And, you know, we've had a lot of requests and concerns raised about, you know, every group that gets money from the state sort of concerned about, don't cut me, start somewhere else. And I hope to just show you with these two slides why it's so hard not to share some of that pain across the entire budget. This is a slide that shows the combined general fund and school aid fund budgets for the state. It's just under $25 billion. You know, these are the two major discretionary pots in the state budget, which still make up less than half of the overall state budget, but the rest are pretty restricted statutory funds and federal funds. And then obviously you can see that school aid alone makes up a larger share than the overall general fund budget. But when you put the two together, over 75% of this combined piece goes back out to either local governments, school districts, or a significant portion in the Health and Human Services budget out to external healthcare providers, be it hospitals, behavioral health providers, physician groups, etc. So, you know, when you take much of that off the table, if we were only to absorb reductions or potential reductions within what people think of as central general government, you're really then talking about the remainder of the Health and Human Services Department, corrections, which makes up a large share of general fund, state police, debt service that is a fixed cost. And then all other, you know, state departments are basically in that 7% bucket on this slide. And that includes the legislature, the judiciary, and then most other general departments. So then if you take school aid out of the mix, and you can see the general fund budget by itself, it's, you know, $10.6 billion, over 80% of that then is to, you know, healthcare, protection of vulnerable children, public safety, and then education here, mostly in the form of higher ed. So then you can see, you know, once the school aid portion removed, that all other goes from 7% to 17%. But even with that, that entire portion is less than $2 billion. And if we only have 6 months left in the year in order to absorb some potential cuts this year, obviously half that money is out the door already. So then you're still looking like at a very small portion, even if we wiped out all of it, to solve what we think is a problem that's probably about 3 times as large as what we would have available in that small bucket. So given that, just to give you an idea of the size of those potential budget reductions, so Treasury early in March, well, mid-March, put out some very early scenarios of what we could be looking at. And this was obviously when Stay Home, Stay Safe was at the very beginning. And so, you know, they weren't working with a ton of information at that point. And that they estimated at the time scenarios ranging from $1 billion to a $3 billion shortfall in fiscal year 20. And again, reductions of $1 billion to $4 billion in 21 compared to where they thought we were when we put out the executive recommendation. They are currently working to, you know, start to read some of the information that's coming in April. However, you know, usually the income tax, the most of the money in the income tax is collected in April. And because the state went along with the federal government to postpone income tax deadlines from April 15th to July 15th, we aren't going to have a very significant portion of that income tax revenue in, and or, you know, the information about how much that's, you know, what it is collecting compared to what we expected until then early August. So we're working at a little bit of a data deficit there. Even on sales tax, there's a significant lag in how the sales tax is collected. And so even when we have the consensus revenue estimating conference next month, we'll still just be in the very early signs of trying to figure out exactly what this overall implication is for the sales tax. So that's why you see such a large range in those potential scenarios. And while we'll have better data next month in May, we still aren't convinced that that will be the best data yet. U of M Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics, RSQE, they put out some revenue estimates 2 weeks ago now. They provide an economic model that does provide some of the basis for both the Treasury estimates and the House and Senate fiscal estimates that will be used at consensus. Their actual revenue estimates are driven by some slightly different things. So there are differences in the actual revenue pieces that kick out. They did estimate a $2.6 billion reduction in fiscal year 20 and a $3.2 billion reduction in fiscal year 21. Those are combined general fund and school aid fund dollars. But as I mentioned, you know, when you saw that chart, you know, the 20 number would be a minimum of a 10% reduction basically out of that total. If you apply it to the remaining portion of the year, double. And the 3.2 is closer to a 15% reduction that we'd be looking at. I will say, you know, their split on their general fund, school aid fund share is a little bit different than I think Treasury's tends to be. And I will say, if you've used or if you've seen some of those numbers shared, there was some misinterpretation of one of their slides. So I think they have somewhere of the 2.6 billion, close to $1 billion that they are assuming would be school aid, and the rest general fund. I think on Treasury's numbers, when we end up getting revenue estimates in the next few weeks, might be slightly closer of a share, but still a larger general fund hit right now than school aid fund. But again, a lot of uncertainty until we at least have an agreed upon consensus in a few weeks. So just to give you an idea of what we're doing specific to COVID appropriations, the legislature appropriated $150 million for us to use to immediately address COVID. This was in early March, right before they left town for their traditional session or regular session. They've been in town twice since. And unfortunately, we're very quickly moving through these funds. And so we'll be at the point where we need to figure out exactly how to either continue to pay for some of our direct COVID costs or try to push some additional costs over to federal funds that are being made available. So for the federal COVID funds, direct to state, there are sort of two major pots that we're able to draw from or work from. The first is FEMA disaster relief funds. I don't have a total here because for the most part, this is an uncapped revenue source. The biggest issue is that, you know, we have a 25% required state match on that right now. We're over the 50 million in automatic general fund that the legislature made available for these types of things. And we will need a transfer to make another 50 million available from the legislature before we have enough to continue on that state match. We've requested that the federal government waive the state match, and we're working with other states that have also requested the same thing. So so we're hoping that that would free up some additional state funds. Obviously, any general fund we don't have to spend on COVID specifically makes potential reductions, or would offset further potential reductions. This, for the most part, the things that we are pushing to FEMA, so that it's things like personal protective equipment, PPE, ventilators, medicines, setting up alternative care sites, hospitals, working with our local governments, et cetera, and all those kinds of supplies. And it also will pay for some overtime of state staff that are having to deal directly with COVID patients. The second largest share, or the second and larger share of federal support to the state right now is from the Corona Relief Fund. And this was in the third of what has now been 4 legislative actions in DC that Congress has approved some funds for. Of a $150 billion pot nationwide, Michigan stands to gain, or has actually now received, $3.9 billion of those funds. Of that $3.9 billion, $800 million is dedicated automatically and went directly from the federal government to 5 local units in Michigan. It was any local unit with a population greater than 500,000. That's what's in the bill. For Michigan, that means the city of Detroit, and it means Kent, Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne counties. So their share, they got that share already directly. And then that leaves about $3.1 billion for the state. Unfortunately, the language in the statute was pretty strict. And this has been a subject of extreme conversation over the last few weeks between states and Congress and the president. We are required to spend this money currently directly on COVID-19 costs. It has to be for things that weren't already in existing budgets or could be funded with existing budgets or through existing line items, and costs that are incurred from March 1 to December 31. The problem with this, obviously, is that we have very precipitous revenue declines, and that's really our number one largest problem, especially when many of our other direct costs could be pushed to that FEMA line. So we have been advocating and working with our national associations to advocate not only for additional state and local funds, because as I mentioned, we're looking at over the next 18 months, potentially something much bigger than this $3.1 billion, but also retroactive flexibility in this line to go back and be able to use this to offset revenue. Obviously, to whatever extent we can get that flexibility, it offsets the needs for those immediate and as deep a cuts as we might otherwise have to be looking at. So we had hoped that they were going to agree to that deal last week. Apparently, at least based on what you read in social media and in tweets by the president, there was a deal that they would make this retroactive fix in the next round, which is supposed to also then potentially include a significant additional piece for state and local revenue in general. But that retroactive flexibility is still a very important piece. In the meantime, unfortunately, it leaves us in a very awkward in-between gray area where if we spend too much of that money or send too much of it out, then we don't have it to backfill those revenue cuts. And obviously, at the same time, we're hearing from the locals that didn't qualify for some of that automatic funding that would like a share of it. And a number of other external entities as well that obviously, statewide, everyone are seeing revenue reductions and are seeing added costs tied to some of these increased cleanings and PPE and all of these other things that different entities are facing. So we're trying to thread that needle right now and figure out how we can best balance those needs. Unfortunately, the guidance that we did end up getting from U.S. Treasury last week on these funds didn't give us a lot of clarity on exactly how this funding can be used, and so we're still working through that as well. So while we continue to work through that, that means we have to keep moving towards some further discussions that we can talk about at the end. Given all of this, I'm going to let Beth then talk about the actual federal education care piece.
Thanks, Bethany, and good afternoon, everyone. As Bethany mentioned, the Federal CARES Act does include several provisions for education-specific purposes. I'm just going to highlight three three large pots of money coming in from the federal government through the CARES Act. The first one is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. We are expected to bring in almost $390 million under this provision. The second is the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund, totaling about $89.4 million. And then thirdly, the Higher Ed Emergency Relief Fund. These are funds totaling roughly $350 million. These funds would flow directly through to the universities and community colleges in the state. Just for a little more detail on the next slide. So the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, again, totaling roughly about $390 million. These funds, the State Department of Education is in the process of applying for these funds. Upon approval of that application, we would receive the full amount. 90% of those funds, however, would flow through to school districts, including public school academies, by formula basis. So those would flow through to districts based on Title I allocations for each district. The 90% of the funds would flow through by that formula. The other 10% could be retained or maintained by the State Department of Education. And we're hearing that they're developing plans to put that 10% in dollars. It's roughly about $40 million to use. So they could use those funds to specifically address or target certain areas of the state. The funds received by districts under this provision, uses are very, very broad. Districts can use these funds for any activities that are authorized under ESEA, IDEA, Adult Ed, Literacy, Perkins. So any of those US DOE provisions would be allowable uses. And then districts could as well, use these funds for really any purpose or needs to address the COVID crisis. It could include training, sanitation, delivery of meals, mental health services, as well as the purchase of education technology and internet connectivity to address remote learning for students. So moving on to the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, we are also in the process of applying for these funds. Upon approval, we would receive a total of $89.4 million. The uses of these funds could kind of fall into three different buckets. The first is to local districts that are determined by the state education agency to be most impacted by the crisis. It could flow to universities or institutions of higher ed that the governor determines to be most impacted. And then that third bucket is kind of a catch-all bucket. So that could be to other entities that the governor determines to be essential for carrying out any emergency related services. These again, the uses are very broad. These funds could be used for the provision of technology. They could be used for early childhood or childcare programs, social and emotional supports, or anything related to the protection of education related jobs. And then the third pot I'll just touch on, this is kind of outside of your area a bit, but again, $350 million under the Higher Ed Emergency Relief Fund. These funds would flow directly to private and public institutions. 90% of those dollars would be based on a formula. So it's kind of based on the Pell versus non-Pell counts per university, as well as there's a smaller 25% portion that's based on other non-Pell recipient rates. I think the important thing to note with this pot of money is that 50% of the funds an institution receives would have to flow directly to student aid to help students with the additional costs that they've borne due to the remote learning. So 50% would go to students directly, and then the institutions could maintain the other 50% to help offset some of the costs that they have maybe either refunded to students or increased technology needs, or really any other, as you can see that second bullet there, really any other use that would be related to the COVID crisis. So with that, that's kind of a high level of the large pieces in the Federal CARES Act for education. At that juncture, I'll just turn it right over to Bethany for budget timelines and wrap up.
Thanks, Beth. So what we're doing currently at the state level is about a month ago, the governor implemented both a hiring freeze and a discretionary spending freeze. And so we're working through the potential savings there. Last week, she also implemented a temporary layoff for all state employees who aren't able to, either aren't critical infrastructure workers, but also weren't able to work to capacity from home. Many state employees are continuing to work from home. We have temporary layoffs for just under 3,000 people that were implemented last week. We've also asked all departments to look at potential budget reductions. We're looking at our one-time fund balances from the prior year, so that we started this year with about $1.2 billion in our budget stabilization fund or rainy day fund. So that's obviously another potential place to go for available funds. We also began the year assuming that we would have about $700 million of carry forward. So, those two things will help offset those costs. But obviously, if the combined reductions over the next 18 months are at that sort of worst case scenario, $7 billion, and I'm not sure that is the worst case scenario anymore, but it was a month ago. Those two things still don't equal $2 billion, and we're really going to need some of that available federal funding, and we're going to need it to be flexible in order to sort of manage this, even with some potentially large reductions. The consensus revenue estimating conference, as I mentioned, is May 15th. We're hoping to work with our legislative partners between now and then and come to some sort of an agreement that would balance the fiscal year 20 budget soon after that. We're very cognizant that both school districts, institutions of higher ed, and local governments all will only have about a month left of their current year budget, and most of their costs will be incurred by that point in the year. At that point, the state will have about a third of its fiscal year left remaining. But again, I'd point you back to those first couple of slides. Despite all that, there's no way I think to get this as large of reductions as possible or as necessary if only focused on those actual small general government portions of the budget, unless we have some significant support from the federal government. And then we assume that once we can at least get through balancing fiscal year 20, that we'll be able to begin fiscal year 21 budget discussions soon after that. This past year, the legislature adopted a budget that said that they would have to have budgets to the governor's desk by July 1. Whether or not that can still happen this year, given the amount of revenue uncertainty that we'll be facing, is a little unclear. We may end up having to revisit the revenue estimates in August after that income tax deadline has come in. And certainly, if many of you have been around, since the last recession, and you all worked through it with us when we ended up having to do budgets very late in the year, that's not optimal, but that may also give the feds a little bit longer to absorb sort of the level of revenue impact that states and locals are feeling, and potentially help address a larger share of that. So given all of that, I know we've thrown some very large numbers at you and a lot of uncertainty, but we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you, Beth and Bethany. As I said before, you can put your questions into the chat box. There is also a raise hand feature, and if you're on the phone, I believe it's *9 to raise your hand. We'll start with, is there a timeline on the spend down of the education funds, similar to how you stated that the Corona relief funds are March through December 2020? Oh,
You might be on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm actually looking, Jen, I might have to get back with you specifically on exactly how long districts have. I know the state has up to a year. If they don't award the funds within a year, they have to return the funds. I believe it's through 20 and 21, but I want to check that for sure. So I'm kind of looking, maybe I'll have an answer before we're done.
okay. Are there discussions about the 389 CARES Act funds being used as a filler for per pupil reductions?
I don't want to jump in if Beth's going to.
I don't
and then-
know. Yeah, I was going to say if you want to take that, Bethany, and I can jump in if.
Sure. So, I mean, I think, you know, right now, unfortunately, everything will be on the table and we'll have to figure out how that best works. The allocation goes out based on Title I distributions, obviously, and maybe not obviously, so that you all know, since it's been a long time since we've talked about it, you know, the May 15th revenue estimating conference will trigger something in the state statute that would trigger a proration discussion. So as soon as that happens and the treasurer and the budget director basically make the governor aware of this official revenue shortfall compared to the budget, then they have 30 days before a proration automatically takes place. That's a per pupil reduction that will be done across the board depending on the size of the shortfall. But what often happens is there's a negotiation between the governor and the legislature that may tweak that somewhat. One of the things that could happen, but we really haven't gotten far enough because we're not clear on exactly the size of the problem we're trying to solve yet is, you know, could it be done as an automatic offset? Potentially, except for that those funds are intended to go out in a way that sort of went more significantly to Title I districts or districts that maybe had a harder time providing some of the additional services that normally would be, you know, required currently. So we'll have to have those conversations.
Staff salaries are my biggest need with impending loss of Per Pupil Foundation. Can these funds be used in part for salaries?
Beth, I think that's a you question.
I mean, I think, you know, the intent is that these dollars are used for additional, I mean, kind of the situation the state is in, not being able to use the federal CARES dollars or the CRF dollars to backfill what's in the state budget. There, you know, there also is a provision in the application that districts have to ensure that they keep their employees working and staff to the extent practicable. Now that, you know, phrase, obviously there's a little flexibility, but I think the intent is that these funds are to be used for response activities related to COVID.
Has there been any discussion regarding districts having to have a budget in place by July 1? And what, if anything, the schools could plan for over the next few months? And there's sort of a similar question to that about allowing districts to provide, allowing districts to do budget adoptions later than June 30th.
We have not had these conversations yet, and we've sort of had that come up, that conversation came up on another webinar and call. I think there's probably some room for that to happen. I don't know exactly how that happens technically. It's a little bit more complicated to figure out how you would manage starting the year late and exactly what all the ramifications for that are from a school district's perspective. So I don't know that I understand the legal and accounting pieces that would go along with how that works exactly. But it's certainly something that could be looked at. I do think we're going to have a limited amount of time where we have the legislature here in town between now and then. And so I do think we're up against timelines on having some of those abilities. I don't know if that's something that the governor could also do through an emergency order or not, but that's something that could be looked at.
Is there any talk about a proration cut for this fiscal year? And then sort of to piggyback off of that, are there any preliminary per pupil funding cuts for next year so they know where to start their budgets from?
I can defer to Beth. This is one of those parts where like we signed in late, so we can't see each other about to jump in or not. But I think, unfortunately, I think everything's on the table if we don't get some additional flexibility from the feds very quickly. I don't know how we will get through the end of this year without some sort of proration. I think my general recommendation is always to do like we are doing currently at the State Budget Office, which is doing a number of scenarios that are from best to worst, and preparing maybe for the worst, and then backfilling where possible, or backpedaling where possible. Obviously, we don't have final numbers that we can tell you because we're still waiting for Treasury and those agreements on that piece, and that's such a big swing in revenue. And then on top of it, the potential for federal funds could really offset it. So, you hate to talk about large numbers and then have to take it all back, but at the same time, I think I'd be preparing for the potential. I realize, just like that we're having to consider from the state that might mean, given the timing of the year, that might mean having to rely more on a fund balance at this point in the year for some of that, if you're able to. I realize oftentimes that also means additional borrowing to get through the next year, to be able to start the beginning of next year. So we're still working through that.
Beth, did you want to add something?
No, I would, I think Bethany articulated very nicely that I think, we just have so many unknowns right now in terms of the larger budget picture. But certainly, I mean, Bethany and I have kind of done this with a few other groups and have advised, that they start to run scenarios and kind of just be ready for potential revenue reductions that we're seeing, particularly for next year. But, we also have a very short amount of time to resolve this year's budget shortfall, the shortfall that we're looking at. So, yeah, I just think that we have to kind of be prepared from, the local perspective and the state perspective to be, we have to adapt to that. I think unfortunately, wish we had more answers, wish we had a better picture. We just don't have that clear of a picture right now. But
I do think I can jump in just before we move to the next one. I do think one of the things that we're certainly advocating for from a state and local perspective is additional federal funds. I think there's some room for, school groups to begin to advocate. A decade ago when we were doing this under the Great Recession, obviously the cuts came a little bit more slowly over 3 years instead of tanking so quickly all at once. And there was some recognition from the federal government, about that impact to schools. And there was a big effort to provide funds specific to that. There's been a lot of political conversations about the discussion of additional state and local funds. I think there's a perception that if they completely fix all of our problems, we'll want to continue to keep the entire economy shut down for stay home, stay safe. Obviously, that's I think a misunderstanding of how the state budget works, and obviously a misunderstanding behind the incentives for the public health response that is happening right now. So I do think there's space for the school community and the school aid community to start to make your local congressional delegation, your legislators aware of the size of this issue potentially and what this will mean given the late timing of the year. Sometimes, educating kids might come off as a more worthy expenditure than sometimes is, when they see the idea of general government, maybe that doesn't seem popular. But as I mentioned, since so much of those funds actually go back out to our locals, having that combined effort on your part as well, I think will really help that message that this is larger than we can solve as a state. This is larger than we have available to us, even though we do have more than $1 billion in the rainy day fund, which is a much better place that we are starting from than we did for the Great Recession. So we're much better off in many ways in that sense. But it's really going to take all of us sort of helping to make those, the size and the impact of those potential budget reductions heard. At the state level, we have to have a balanced budget. We can't run a deficit like the federal government can. And unfortunately, the size and the speed of this is just something we're not going to be able to do without them.
That's a great point about contacting our congressional delegation as well. Will you have an FAQ related to applying and acceptable uses of the CARES money to help guide our districts?
This is Beth. Yeah, I mean, we're starting to meet with the Department of Ed. I assume, the Department of Ed is actually, they will be administering the kind of the Title I allocation, or the 390 million. So they are starting to work on the application process. I imagine, just as the U.S. Department of Ed, they made available a very streamlined application whereas states apply. I believe the State Department of Ed is also looking at a very streamlined application that districts would complete in order to access those funds. But certainly, I mean, we're all working together to provide as much information as we can, and that's why these are helpful, just to get some questions. We may not have the answers today, but just to get some of the questions that you all are thinking about that need to be addressed in further guidance.
So you had mentioned that our congressional delegation has been working really well right now. Can you talk a little bit about how they're assisting in some of this legislation going forward? Do you have any insight into that?
I don't really, other than, they've at least been listening to us. I do think some of the pushback we've gotten has been, that they want to see, they want to see some state cuts first. I think because we don't have hard revenue numbers yet, it's been a little hard still to make everyone aware of the size of the problem that we're facing. And so I think over the next 3 weeks, as we get to the revenue estimating conference and we have to start putting out an actual budget that balances the size of the hole we have, that will probably become more obvious. And so then, that will make our job a little easier in that sense. Unfortunately, that also means we have to send out some very scary numbers before we know whether or not they're going to approve another round of stimulus or retroactively fix that. So we're not doing that to scare you, but those are legitimately the things we're going to have to be looking at if we don't get those things. So that it might take that process before we have some better answers.
With the EO to maintain distance learning and to continue to employ all K-12 staff, does that apply to preschool teachers and staff? And then also there's a couple questions about if the state is laying off non-essential employees, why can't the school? Why are they required to pay everyone? And I think some of that on the second piece is going to be related to your collective bargaining agreement. But if you want to speak to the other part of it.
So I think, this is Beth. So I think that, I think the first part of the question was in terms of the preschool employees. I think, GSRP funds are still flowing through to districts. So they're still receiving 11th of the Great Start Readiness Program funds. So I think that's one aspect. The other, I didn't mention, another pot of money that's being made available through the CARES Act is $100 million coming through for the child care program. So we are ramping up, I believe this week, they are unveiling some new proposals. These would be childcare programs that specifically target, not only do they target frontline workers or essential workers, but the purpose of that is also to keep those childcare centers open that may otherwise have to be forced to close, and in order to kind of maintain the sustainability of our childcare center going forward. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Beth, I don't know if you want to talk about the EO piece, but as I understood it, it was in order to be able to count your days, you had to sort of keep staff on. I don't think as we get to a spot, if we had to do an EO, obviously, either EO reductions or a negative supplemental in some way, I think there's a shared understanding that that you'll have to balance that out as best as possible. I don't think the EO said you must keep all staff paid. I think there was some question on that, and I'm not the expert on that piece of it myself. I don't know if Beth, you have it. I don't know if it was just contract workers or exactly what that will mean, but obviously there is some flexibility as we actually have to do budget reductions.
It's our understanding under the EO, you had to pay staff that was working and redeploy staff as you could so that you could pay as many as possible. But if staff absolutely could not work from home or wasn't working, then they could be laid off. That was our understanding. But there was a huge push to make sure we were paying all of our staff. And obviously, as we look at budget cuts and prorations possibly coming down, that's going to change that conversation. But as Brad would want me to say from MASB, you really need to check your CBA and how some of those things work with layoffs and things like that. And now is probably a good time to start looking into those things. Is there a limit on how much of the rainy day fund must be kept in the rainy day fund and not spent?
So I think under the current statute, we can take 25% of the balance automatically given the current revenue situation. So anything other than that will take a statutory requirement, but we assume, or a statutory amendment, but we assume that if this is part of the overall budget solution, then the legislature would do an amendment to that at the same time. So a number of the things we'll do might take some statutory changes and will be done as a package.
This is just another way, I think, to ask the same question, but I'll put it out there anyway. Is there a rule of thumb, and I'm guessing any rule of thumb in this time is probably out the window, but is there a rule of thumb on what % of our annual budgets that we could, when we start discussing cuts? Did I make sense?
I don't know, Beth, if you want to talk about per pupil balances or.
I mean, I think, we've got a rule of thumb. This doesn't translate into necessarily the budget hole that we're looking at, but a straight $500 million shortfall in the school aid fund would equate to about 340 or 345 per pupil. So, while I'm not saying that's the number that we're looking at, that's just a rule of thumb. That's just something, as you start to see the shortfall numbers that Bethany is talking about, that just kind of gives you a sense of the magnitude there. And that would be outside of any other alternative solutions. As Bethany said, there are a lot of unknowns, different moving parts that would change those numbers. So I think that's just a rule of thumb that we've been using.
And that's for fiscal year 20 or 21?
I think we use the 21 pupil count, so probably 21.
But probably fairly close, right? I mean, whatever the dollar amount is, you divide by 1,000,004, 1,000,005. pupils, and you can get some pretty round numbers, right?
Not going to change more than probably $5 a pupil. I mean, it's just, yeah, just a ballpark.
So if we need to maintain the GSRP because money is flowing, what about the community ed preschools that are closed at this moment?
So those would be the dollars that are coming through the GSRP allocation. Is that the question?
I think so. Stacy Brickman, are you?
The CBOs.
It's a question.
So we have GSRP, and then we also have community ed preschool that is funded by parents. They pay a tuition. It is not, we don't get any funding from the state for that. Are those employees also need to be made whole?
I don't know the answer. I mean, that's a
Right.
question. I mean, if you're not receiving state funds for that, I think that would be probably a local decision. I don't know, Bethany, do you have thoughts?
I think so
we're getting
too.
conflicting legal advice. That's why I'm asking it.
Yeah, we're not lawyers. We're
Yeah.
definitely not district lawyers. So unfortunately, I don't think we can be helpful on that one.
Thanks.
So there were a couple of questions related to the emergency manager law, but not just that one, but early warning. So under early warning, you get put on into that early warning system if you have less than 5% of your fund balance. Is that something that is going to continue, knowing that districts across the state are going to be dipping into that fund balance? Is the emergency manager law and that early warning law going to still apply?
I don't think that we've talked, I mean, we haven't necessarily talked about that yet. So I think it's certainly something that, you know, we should be mindful of once we, you know, figure out what we're actually looking at in terms of if there are budget reductions or certainly a good point.
And I know you're not the experts on the EO, so we'll probably have to drive these questions to someone else, but a lot of the questions that are coming up revolve around that. If we have a proration this year of our funding, the EO says we won't receive funding if we don't pay our staff. And so I don't know if that's, I know you said you're not the experts on that, so I don't know if there's something more you can say about that, or if it's just a message you could carry back. Because I'm seeing that question come up over and over, that if the state can lay people off, why can't we, if we're going to be facing these budget cuts?
I'd guess that there has to be another round of conversations around that. I mean, obviously at the time that the EO went out, I don't know that anyone totally understood the picture that we were going to be in on a revenue side, and, you know, and potentially we won't have to be in that spot. But I think if we do have to significantly reduce school aid fund revenue still for the remainder of the year, I think that'll have to be something that, you know, is part of a conversation and may be revisited.
I think that would definitely be appreciated. When you're looking at pupil counts for next year, do you have any data showing student transfers from traditional publics into virtual schools when we talk about projecting enrollment?
So we will be starting to work with the fiscal agencies in preparation for the May 15th consensus. And we'll be talking about this particular topic. I know there's, you know, there's some consideration out there, and there's some concern that we could have some drops in enrollment if parents choose to keep their kids, if schools are in class and they're open, if parents may choose to keep their students home. So, you know, we will be looking at that. I don't know, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard to like peg a number on that, on the impact of that. One, we don't exactly know what the fall is going to look like in terms of our school buildings. And two, you know, we're not sure to the extent parents would actually just start homeschooling their kids. I'm not sure that that's going to be a wave, but to the extent we have more students who are equipped and teachers who are equipped for remote learning, maybe that happens. Maybe it looks a little different than it, did a year ago. But we are certainly trying to look at that aspect of our pupil count estimates for next year.
That was a clarifying question. The $345 per pupil cut you mentioned for 500 million, is that $345 per pupil per 500 million?
Yes. So a $500 million shortfall, in order to capture that back, would result in a 345 per pupil reduction.
Okay. And then the last question is, are there conversations about freeing up how Title I and at-risk funds can be spent? Any way to shift those funds around without getting penalized would be helpful.
I think agreed. I mean, anything we can get in terms of flexibility with those funds would be helpful. I really have yet to see some full-blown guidance from the feds on this particular pot of money. So they have indicated they're going to issue some more guidance. So we're waiting on that. I do have just a clarification on a question that came up earlier. So although I mentioned, so states, the Title I allocations to districts, states have to award that within the year, which I don't imagine it's going to take that long. The US DOE is urging states to move the money quickly. But given that, it does say that the funds can be obligated through September 30th, 2022.
With that, I want to thank Bethany and Beth for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking this time and answering our questions. I know there were a few questions in the chat that weren't budget related that I will gladly answer. I just didn't want to keep the two of them on the line. So I want to say thank you again for all of this, and I'm sure I'll be sending more questions your way.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I know it's more that we don't know than we do. So we appreciate the tough spot you're in. We feel the same way at the State Budget Office. And, maybe we can do this again once we all have a little bit better picture of things. So.
That would be great. Thank you. And then some of the questions that came in that were for MASB, and one of them was about construction. We have been talking about construction and allowing construction to happen for probably a greater part of a month now. It was not part of the governor's EO this last time, but I don't think that means it's off the table. I know that the trades are also talking with the departments and with the governor about what safe practices look like. They are not new to needing safe practices in construction sites. So we're hopeful that we will get some relief on that coming up. I don't know if it'll be, the beginning of May, or it'll be after the May 15th, the latest expiration of the Stay Home, Stay Safe. But those conversations are happening. We've been involved in them as well, and we'll keep you posted as we know more. But it does look like progress has been made. We just don't have answers about that quite yet. And then there was the next one. There's a question on there sort of given to everybody. What are some creative ideas districts are using for students who don't have tablets or reliable Wi-Fi? If you have ideas, you can toss up in the chat. That would be great. Some of the things we've heard are, packet distribution. Some of them are using their school buses to run busing routes to deliver packages and packets. But I'm sure there are a lot of other things that districts are facing. So if you have ideas that you can add to that, that would be great. And on the emergency manager and early warning law, we will be talking to the governor's office outside of, I don't think the budget office can really answer that question, but we'll certainly be bringing that to their attention, because it's not out of the realm of possibility that we have a large amount of districts that will fall below that 5% fund balance. And that certainly was not the intent of Treasury. Next one. I'm trying to keep track of the other ones. Give me 1 second. setting the budget date back. This has come up a few times, and as Bethany said, we're not sure, her and I actually talked about this last week, we're not sure what that would mean, because while we understand that you want time to set your budgets, your fiscal year starts July 1. And so there are budgetary and probably legal problems or things that need to be addressed. So that's not an easy question to answer. It's one that I started having with our legal counsel about what exactly boards would need to do. And at this point, we're saying you have to have it passed by June 30th. But we are trying to see if there's a way to get around that. The other thing Bethany said is if it takes any sort of legislative action, we are really running short on that because they're not coming back that often. But I do think there is more to it than just saying it's okay, don't have your budget done until September when your fiscal year starts in July. So we know that this will be helpful. We just aren't quite sure how it would logistically work. I think that's about it. Are there any other questions before we sign off? Oh, I should answer this. The Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference is on May 15th. The school business officials and MASB will do another one of these webinars on May 18th to sort of talk about what we learned. I think at that point is when the legislature will sit down and seriously consider what the budget has to look like. So it's going to be the end of that month at the earliest when you will know about cuts. There are budget conversations going on now, but it's really hard to have those when they don't have numbers. So they're sort of looking at best and worst case scenarios as well, but nobody wants to put that out until we can see what CREC has to say. So that'll come out on the 15th. I would expect conversations to start probably immediately, but as far as getting to the point where you'll know what cuts are coming, I would say probably the end of the month at the earliest. And talking about what school would look like in the fall, this has been something that comes up a lot too. There's various things out there that other states are talking about. We haven't quite gotten to that point. Some of this is going to have to be done with our talks with your local unions as far as what your day looks like when your school starts. Lowering class sizes when we're in the midst of a teacher shortage is going to be an issue too. So we know there's a lot to think about for the fall, and those conversations are happening for sure. I just don't have a lot of guidance on what to tell you. And then considerations about MIPSers. We are hearing that the legislature is going to look at MIPSers as a way of saving money. If they refinance it, they can change the amount that the state is paying and push some of that money into the per pupil. So MIPSers is definitely on the minds of all the legislators. We just don't know exactly what it will look like. All right, I think that's about it. Thank you all for joining us today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything Jeff, DeShandre, or I can do for you.